Welcome to episode 2 of The Ranch, where we discuss thoughts, ideas, technology, decentralization, and privacy, and the intersection of all of these things.
Absolutely. I'm Alex, and I'm here with Cameron once again.
We're both here.
So this week, our episode of The Ranch is going to be about the gentrification of the internet, which might sound like a bit of a strange concept to bring up. Normally, people talk about gentrification in real-world terms, but basically, it's referring to people coming into an area and generally, typically poor areas, right? And basically pricing out the people who live there and who use that area and have lived there for a long time and built communities there, built infrastructure there, etc. Coming in and basically taking it over and making it normally more middle or upper middle class kind of tastes, and it makes it impossible for the people who actually created and built those places and those communities to continue existing there, right? And this is a phenomenon that normally gets kind of observed in urban spaces, especially like inner city suburbs are a common kind of hotspot for gentrification. But I think that there's kind of a similar thing going on with the internet or with the web.
I would say so. I would say that a lot of the first adopters of the web, people who were a part of those communities, feel the same way about what has happened with Web 2 and the proliferation of these enormous centralized companies that have sort of taken control of the internet and taken control of something which was once very different to the way that it is now. And it's been turned into something that the people who were here from the beginning, people who were building these communities and originally had their hands on the reins of the infrastructure, have been pushed to the side, much in the same way that people are in the meat space outside of the metaverse when gentrification occurs.
Yeah. So when we think about technology, right, anybody who kind of took any history class ever maybe would have gone over the concept of, what is technology? What do we classify as technology? And, it's like highly contextual, but you go through these kind of thought experiments or just thinking about how, the wheel is a piece of technology in a way, right? But we don't really think about the wheel as being technology now. In fact, we don't even really think about specific things as being technology or being tech anymore.
Basically, like anything, like a spear, like a monkey with a spear.
Anything that was made.
Right? Yeah, anything that's a tool that's used, it's essentially tech.
Yeah, but now we have this kind of different conceptualization of tech
Yeah.
and technology, right? Which refers not to the actual things that are being made, like a spear, I guess, or a wheel, or even an iPhone, but it refers to this like overarching abstract concept of tech, which is made up by the tech industry, tech companies, tech media, pieces of technology, like tech systems. There's all these different kinds of things that kind of amalgamate together into this concept that we have, which is both very specific and very vague about what tech is now.
For sure. Like if you think about like the tech industry, like every industry is the tech industry in some way.
Yeah.
Like
it's kind of spread its tentacles into every corner
because
of
technology
life.
is a part of everything that we use every day, every product, and like even like services in a sense can be thought of as technology. And so it's kind of strange that technology as an industry is thought of in a very specific and sort of narrow way, where it's basically defined as computerized consumer tech and things that exist on the internet.
Yeah. Well, like you're kind of saying there, right? Like tech has really become this dominant force where technology is really, and the tech industry, right, is pretty much the most dominant industry that we have in our modern world, both from an economic perspective and from a cultural perspective. Pretty much, everything is connected to tech in some kind of way. And we're ending up in this position where tech, this tech industry that we have is structured in such a way that there are a few big players that are kind of reaping all the benefits of this ever-growing tech,
sure.
enabled world.
I think it's like something like 25%. I saw recently, you showed me that the infographic, 25% of like the whole S&P 500
yeah.
is all just like a handful
Five
of like
tech companies.
tech
Yeah,
companies,
the big
and
tech
then
companies.
like those companies are sort of like have these figureheads that sort of seem to be like this little cabal almost. That's the feeling of it. It's like this cabal of people who just have so much influence over the world that we live in. And it's more complicated than that, but it is sort of like a cartoonish it's like system when you take a step back and like really look at it.
Yeah, and all the big decisions are being made by those companies, and more or less the standards and values and platforms that they adopt or push are pretty much forced on everybody else, because you kind of have to come in line with whatever they're saying
Yeah,
to do,
for
and
sure.
they've controlled so much of this like ever-present tech industry now, right? Like they've pretty much captured the entire setup.
Yeah.
That's everything from infrastructure to the literal programmers, to even like executives and things that are the most influential are all, funneling into these big companies. And that creates a huge problem, right? Because then now suddenly the only decisions that matter are being made by these one company, and it's this top-down decision-making
for sure.
approach, right? And
Much in
like,
the same. Sorry.
I was just going to say, the decision that an engineer at Facebook makes is potentially going to affect so many people, and they have no way of necessarily opting in or out of that decision that they make.
Yeah,
It's kind of just
for sure.
forced on you.
And yeah, in much the same way that you don't really like I don't wake up and like choose to be like a Facebook user or a Twitter user or whatever I'm on. You know what I mean? It's like these things are just like a necessity. It's such a big like you're a full on like Luddite if you like opt out of like all of these things. It's like a really, really crazy thing for someone to do. And it affects your life in like a lot of like you're just disconnected from people. It's really hard to do. It's really hard to you have to live a very specific lifestyle to do that. And in much the same way that like people are sucked into it that way, there's a brain drain of people, engineers away from other areas where all of these resources are just like getting sucked up into like this tech industry and these things that these people are building, where like it's crazy to think about what else we would be doing with all of like human ingenuity in the year 2021 if so much resources and everything wasn't being poured into like social media and
Tech industries.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And this wouldn't necessarily be as big of a problem if these big tech companies were these like benevolent, kind of friendly like local neighborhood big tech company. But that's just not how the world works, right? And as more and more power keeps funneling towards them, and there's more and more, they've got not only their own tech industry, but also just our kind of global community cornered, the more they can make these really, or behave in these really evil ways without serious repercussions, right?
Yeah, for sure. Well, everyone's constantly trying to create repercussions, whether it's like legislative or grassroots activism from the people that are caught up in it. Nothing really seems to stick.
Yeah. So there's this concept that kind of came around maybe like 5 years ago now, I suppose, or the concept existed before, but it kind of had this resurgence of techlash, right? Where there was this, backlash against big tech companies for basically doing evil stuff, A lot of this, I think, kind of surfaced around the Cambridge Analytica scandal with Facebook, and people kind of started uncovering all of these really dodgy practices that large tech companies were doing, and starting to like realize and piece together what the actual meaning and consequences of the way that they were and their practices
The veil was
were,
pulled
right?
back.
Yeah, exactly.
Was that like 2014,
Yeah,
roughly?
2015, yeah.
And then like, would you say Facebook sort of really started to take off around like 2010-ish?
Yeah.
A bit earlier than that. It's like for a 5-year period, and then that happened. And then it's been like 10 years. 10 years of people being like, I don't know about this. Like, this is bad. And like, nothing.
Yeah, we're kind of in this position, right, where like people realize that Facebook's bad, and it's this like open secret that Facebook is terrible. But at the same time, pretty much everybody keeps using it.
It's almost like if you have like this repressive government, and everyone knows that like it's really bad, but no one really knows what to like do about it.
Yeah, exactly, right. You're kind of completely cornered. And with Techlash, there was this kind of like semi-coordinated groundswell of backlash against companies like Facebook, and there was like I don't know if you remember the like hashtag delete Facebook,
Yeah.
which still kind of comes up from time to time, but
People give it a crack.
but
They're like, maybe this time.
But like a few years back, right? There was this huge wave of people being like, all right, like a grassroots movement of people being like, all right, like let's get rid of Facebook, let's just delete it, everybody, let's get out, and then Mark Zuckerberg comes out and he's like, oh yeah, well we keep profiles on everybody, even people who are not Facebook users.
Even people that never had it, right? Not even just people that have deleted it. Like people that have never had it that are just part of it. If like this person has it and this person has it, this person that's in between them, they have a profile of this person. They have information about them.
So it's things like that kind of really, it was demoralizing, and it really kind of squashed the movement in a way.
But also it's a hashtag delete Facebook.
Yeah.
It's like you're using the tools that were given to you by these sort of platforms in order to try and remove
the system. You're using the system to try and change the system, but it doesn't really work.
You just sort of step outside of the paradigm.
Yeah. So obviously, it was this like symbolic kind of like squashing of this resistance against Facebook that happened. And people kind of just moved on. We're in this position, we're in this spot now, right, where people kind of like somewhat reluctantly use Facebook, but they do use it.
For sure.
I don't know many people who don't use it really.
I think back then it was something that you actively did, whereas now you kind of don't think about it. It's like most people like use Messenger. No one's really like scrolling their Facebook feed these days. At least like not
but
like millennials and Gen Zs.
Right?
Yeah, but you don't think about it though. It's just like this means of communication that if you want to get in touch with that person, you're just like.
Yeah, and this is the problem, right? Is that people are kind of trapped in the system, and there's not really good ways to escape it.
So it seems almost like there's got to be an inevitable breaking point, right? And there's got to be a paradigm shift.
Yeah.
And some people say that Web3 is the new paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely. So there's this kind of problem, right, where the way that the web is set up, the way that Web 2 is set up, is that, the earliest movers and the best, or the people who succeeded first are just going to keep succeeding and keep, basically like absorbing all the other success stories.
Much the same way that in the Australian property market, if you're getting priced out of a suburb, it's probably by people who, owned property in the first place.
Exactly, yeah, right. And all the control, gets taken away from the people who actually use it, right? Like, the average user has no say in the governance of Facebook.
For sure.
The
but you're paying rent.
Have a say.
You're paying that rent.
But yeah, and the rent that you pay is, in the form of like data and lack of choices and, tech solutions that don't actually solve anything for you.
Yeah. You're inhabiting a space. You're inhabiting this digital house called Facebook, and you're getting rats. You're getting roaches.
Yeah.
The door falls off the hinges, and the whole time, like, you're paying your rent.
Yeah.
You're paying your rent. In fact, they're taking more.
Yeah.
They're taking more and more.
They actually keep upping the rent.
Yeah, and right? the quality of your digital lodgings steeply declining.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, right? And the price of a local digital coffee is like through the roof. But yeah, so there's got to be kind of this better way, right? But the thing is, is that, and the techlash kind of also was a part of this problem, right? Where the tech industry, and when I say this, I'm not talking about any specific company or group or person or whatever. But the tech industry has kind of convinced everybody that, when, for example, Facebook does some evil thing, well, that's not really Facebook. That's not the problem with technology. The problem is with Facebook. Facebook is evil, but the technology is completely fine. Like, the concept of social media is fine.
And they humanize it. They're like, it's Mark.
Yeah.
That Mark Zuckerberg fella, terrible guy.
People start making fun of Mark and his smoked meats, or making fun of Mark and his like awkward, really kind of robotic personality.
Yeah.
But as soon as they chuck Mark out, there's this other, there's like Elon Musk to take his place. There's Zuck Zuckerberg to take his place. Like there's somebody else that's ready to step in and be the next, great hope for the tech industry and that comes in and like don't be evil kind of mantra,
for sure.
and there's everyone like loves them and showers them in gratitude, and they're like this idol.
Well, that's kind of what Elon is to a lot of people as
He
well.
is, right?
People
But,
look to him as like,
there's a time in people's past where people felt this way about Mark.
Yeah,
There's
for
a
sure.
time in people's past where they felt this way about about Jack Dorsey.
Yeah.
About any given person who's climbed the tech mountain, right? And then eventually we get sick of them, or like we start thinking maybe they're actually not such a nice person, and we sort of throw them out, but we just replace them with another person who is eventually probably going to have the same kind of problem with them.
Yeah, it's still just like symptoms of the same thing. If
Yeah.
you're sort of just like treating the symptom and not treating the underlying
Yeah,
cause of
right.
the problem, which is not going to get anywhere. You need to sort of move beyond that and take a step back and look at what's really happening.
So
behind the scenes.
it's like a system, right, that is pushing all of these people up, and the system is ready to replace them. As soon as we decide as the people that we've had enough of a particular person or a particular company, we can take them out. We can do #delete Facebook and get rid of it. But just as soon as we do that, the system is ready to just put another just as problematic, just as exploitative company or platform right in its place. And so then we end up with this self-perpetuating system where people blindly trust the technology that's coming through because, of course, tech is a good thing, right? Like tech, like, oh, thank God, all the technology around me, it makes my life so much easier and better and more convenient and faster, and I'm more connected and blah, blah, blah. But the thing is, right, is like as much as that might be true in some respects, we also have to look at the systems of technology and what they're outputting and question whether the system of technology that we have right now, the tech system that is made up of big tech and tech journalists and technocrats and whatever, whether that system is good, right?
It's kind of crazy that you have, the dominant industry in our society with all of these resources going into it, billions and billions, trillions of dollars, and you even have to ask the question of like, is what's being output, is it actually a positive thing for society at all?
Yeah.
You know what I mean?
Yeah.
It's like, it seems very misguided that we would have ended up in a situation where we even have to ask that question. But we definitely do, because it can be hard. Like, you look at it from certain angles and it's not a good thing.
Yeah.
There are a lot of like very visceral statistics, particularly in the way that this sort of the tech industry affects Gen Z and young people, teenagers who have grown up with this stuff all around them all the time. It's in a lot of ways not so good for them.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's difficult to have this conversation because, you say to somebody, oh, well, what if the system that led us to the iPhone or the personal computer was actually a bad system? They're like, what are you talking about? Like, people like iPhones, they like computers.
Yeah.
Overall, the overwhelming opinion is that they're great things and great innovations that have improved our lives. And obviously, in many ways, that is true. But we sort of like assume that now, Facebook is carrying that torch, and that, this system is going to continue producing good results, which, like you said, we need to bring that into question. And I think that the way that the web has gone specifically it's a bad way. It's a way that has taken control away from the users.
Yeah.
It's a way that has taken control away from taking control and choice away from the users in every pretty much imaginable way.
It's really sad because it's sort of moved into a place where it's the exact opposite of like what people imagined it to be when it first started to be built out, and when it was first like the early adopters were kind of like doing the work and creating what we now know to be the internet. It was looked at, it was decentralized. It was, and now people have sort of taken that away. It's become extremely centralized, and it's become controlled. So much of the digital world that we live in is controlled by companies that have completely centralized it.
Yeah. So as you sort of alluded to, there's this, Web3, right, concept which is trying to restructure the web and the internet in the way that it was originally intended to be, right? In a way where the people who use it are making the choices around what it is and what it looks like, and they have control over how they interact with it and how it interacts with them as well, right? Because at the moment that doesn't exist. And Web3 is all about shifting the power structures that we have on the web away from these big centralized companies and towards the users, and allowing the users themselves to govern the internet that they live on, right? So there's a lot of different sort of ways that we can try to achieve this, and I think that the two main ones that I think about, right, is the ability for people to audit and the ability for people to control, right?
Yeah.
And control comes in many different ways. There's control in the sense is like decision-making control, right, which is like governance, I guess. Like who decides what changes to make, who decides what to keep, who decides what what color to make the logo, like how are these decisions being made and who makes them, and who
The
has
design
the
and the way that it affects you.
Yeah,
Because
yeah.
it's we live in digital spaces. We kind of touched on this in episode 1 of The Ranch. You live almost more of your life in digital spaces than you do outside of them these days. We spend so much time using computers and smartphones and whatever, and like the Facebook algorithm or whatever, it can, like, they've done experiments where they just experimented on people and they sort of like gave people like happy content to see what will happen and sad content to see if it would make them sad, and it did, and it affects people so much, and you have no control over it. So I think that it really needs to be like on like a engineering level, the way that these things are built, we rely on them to live in the world that exists today, and we should have some level of control over the way that it is built, I mean, the way it affects us, I think.
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a very exploitative the way that it is now.
It
should not be.
So, there's the control around the decisions, and then there's also control around the implementation, right? And obviously that comes by means of the engineers, who I guess are, like the direct, or should be, right? At the moment, engineers, in like a computing context, are kind of the like connection between the company and the machine. But in this system, right, the engineers can be the connection between the people and the machine, right?
For sure.
And that should theoretically lead towards way more fair and equitable and transparent systems, if it's actually, the engineers are facilitating the choices of the users as opposed to facilitating the choices for the company.
Yeah, well, it's kind of like you look at the motivation and what decisions are being made and why.
Yeah.
And if you put it in a Web3 context where it's community driven, it's all like the needs of the community and what makes people healthy and happy is what's at the forefront of the decision making. Yeah. Whereas at the moment, it's kind of like the opposite. Like it's kind of like it's all driven by the share price of these companies that are in the tech industry.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you end up having engineers making decisions that are like making people less healthy and happy, and driving rage and division in society, and eroding democracy and motivating genocide. Like,
well, this is
insane.
like kind of what you were saying before, right? Like with Facebook, how I think there were recently even in another series of like documents were released showing that they were designing or making choices around the Facebook algorithm, and they'd done some testing, and they kind of came to this realization that when they evoked feelings of anger or madness or frustration, people engaged more heavily for longer, versus when they made content that made them happy or joyful, etc. Right?
It's bad business. You can't have happy.
Happy if you're an engineer that's working for Facebook, well, Facebook is going to say, all right, and there was this exact conflict. You could kind of see it play out in their internal memos, where it was like the engineer was like, okay, so whatever, we're still gonna like show people the content that makes them happy, right? And they were like, no, like show them the content that makes them stay on Facebook, please. But if that same engineer was instead had the agency, I guess, to make the choice for the people as opposed to for the company, we could have had a completely different outcome. Yeah, and we've seen all the evils that have come from that part of the Facebook algorithm, and all of that could be avoided in a world where the choice is user driven. right?
It's a big Wazowski moment for that engineer right there.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, I think that it's kind of crazy when you think about the fact that a lot of these people are just regular people who don't want to be confined within systems like that have those sorts of incentives in place that sort of pressure them to behave in that way and create that sort of thing in their work. They don't want to do that, I don't think.
No.
So it's a kind of a freeing thing for the users and for the people that are building it as well.
Well, it's interesting because this is obviously slightly different. You know, these are not software engineers that we would be talking about in this context, but I was listening to another podcast talking about how, you know, engineers don't really want to take military contracts a lot of the time because, you know, they don't want to make weapons that kill people or, you know, drones that are going to go and like bomb some innocent, you know, place or whatever. It's just a bit like, it's not nice. Like, people don't want to make weapons and do things that they feel like are gonna at a moral conflict with them. And I think we're gonna head to this place, and this is happening increasingly, where engineers are like, no, I don't want to work for a big tech company.
Yeah, no,
I want to work in Web3 or like for something else that
This is happening at
it's
the
not
moment.
icky.
I've read about this. Like, apparently Facebook at the moment, like currently, is having a lot of issues with finding engineers because it's so widespread. It's so wide, the disgust, the way that people feel about Facebook in particular, but just like big tech in general, is like people are so aware now that even though that's where a lot of the money is, it's people are sort of taking it upon themselves to create that new paradigm.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've talked a bit about control here, right, as one of the important systemic shifts that needs to happen. But I think the other thing is auditability, right? You need to be able to audit what's going on, and we've seen this be a big problem with pretty much all the algorithm-driven platforms, right? Is that it's this closed box.
Even they don't know, man.
They don't know, right? And we've seen. I remember this was a number of years ago, but it was around the time when there were a bunch of issues with the YouTube algorithm, and basically like all of these really well-known creators were suddenly not being recommended to their own audiences that were following them. And, you know, there was this huge backlash against YouTube of people being like, hey, like, you know, what's going on with the algorithm? And they had to repeatedly say, we don't know. You know, we don't know what's going on or why.
This is how they made Skynet. This is how Skynet goes live.
Yeah. But, like, this is an issue with pretty much every algorithm-driven platform, right? Is that there's just not enough confidence around how it's working, or not necessarily around how it's working, but why it's coming to those conclusions.
And that's miles away from like independent auditing. You know what I mean? Having other people being able to look inside the machine and see how it's functioning.
Yes.
It's like even the people that are behind the curtain of the closed source code, they still don't even. So it's kind of like several steps away from being somewhere where it could be.
So exactly. So when we talk about wanting it to be auditable, we mean not only should someone be able to look at the code and understand what's happening, anyone should be able to look, right? Like anybody that has the means should be able to look into, you know, behind the curtain and see that the thing is doing what it says on the box.
Yeah.
And that's just important from a transparency perspective, right? Because otherwise you end up in these situations where you're basically taking somebody's word for it, and that just leads to bad outcomes, overwhelmingly. Sure. Eventually, someone's going to realize that they can kind of lie and get ahead, and they're going to do that. But yeah, you know, so...
People are fed up. People are fed up with the state of the web at the moment. People are fed up with the rats and the roaches and the doors hanging off the hinges.
Yeah.
They're sick of the rent going up.
Yeah.
And I think that soon people are going to band together once everyone sort of realizes the potential of Web3, what can be built, what the implications of that are, and whether they can benefit from it. Yeah. I think that we're going to see a lot change very quickly.
Yeah, I agree. I think there's going to be absolutely an uprising, I would say, of a Web3 uprising where people are just coming up and creating systems that actually benefit them and benefit all of the other users around them and benefit us, you know, as both a global community and our own local communities that we're in much more deeply and have our best interests at heart, unlike you know, big tech companies that are just trying to get their stock price to go up.
Absolutely. And I think people might look back at certain certain pre-internet sort of conditions that people lived in that were very exploitative, and they might say, I can't believe that that's what it used to be like.
Yeah,
You know what
exactly.
I mean?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
So yeah.
Like looking back on the coal mines from the 1920s.
Yeah, I'd be like, whoa.
Can't believe they did that.
That wasn't great. But yeah, so...
No
do a
segue,
Lokinet
just
plug?
do the plug. All
Yeah,
right.
still plug.
We're from Oxen, so check out Oxen at oxen.io. We make a messaging app that's a Web3 app called Session. You can find that at getsession.org, so go and check that out as well. And an onion router, which is also kind of a Web3 kind of style situation, which is called Lokinet, which you can find at lokinet.org. But most of all, and most importantly, if you liked hearing to us chatter for the last 30 minutes or so, make sure to subscribe up to The Ranch, check in for episode 3, which will be coming at you fast in a couple of weeks' time.
Anonymity on the internet, I believe.
Anonymity on the internet? Yes, yes. Anonymity on the internet, which is a big hot topic, especially in Australia right now.
It's boiling.
With some new, the latest trick from the Australian government coming out of the woodwork.
Such a wacky
government.
Quirky guys.
Yeah.
And gals.
So, make sure you tune in. Thanks for having us. Ciao.
I'll see you then.